All right. Our first session is going to be moderated by Ed Blanchard Wrigglesworth. He's from the University of Washington. He's online. He's in that middle box on the right. You can see. Wave, Ed. There you go. And he'll take it over from here. One other comment for the speakers in the room. Who go up there, when you use the laser pointer, obviously nobody online can see the laser pointer. And I guess we're not really set up to move a mouse. So you're going to have to describe what you're pointing at. You could just do that, like say, I'm pointing at X or I'm pointing at Y. So that'll be helpful, I think, for people online. And then that, take it away.
Thanks, Matt. So we have 3 speakers in the morning session, and we're going to start with Martha Buckley, who's given an invited talk. Martha's an invited, a research assistant professor at George Mason University, working on AMOC and North Atlantic SST and heat content predictability problems. So the first 2 talks are 15 minutes and the third one's 10 minutes, and I will give you a 2-minute warning before the end of the allocated times. Martha, take it away.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I really am very surprised for the invitation because this field is very new to me. So let's see here. The title of my talk is The Role of Ocean Processes in Predictability of Sea Surface Temperatures in the Subpolar North Atlantic. I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators, Tim Dissel and Laurie Chenry from George Mason, and Laura Zana from NYU. So just as a review, as Gerald stated already, that climate predictions are needed on all timescales. On one end here, we have weather predictions, which are essentially initial value problem. And on the other hand here, we have long-term climate change projections, which are basically a forced boundary condition problem due to external forcing. And here in the middle is in the interannual to decadal timescale, where both the initial value and the external forcing is important. And because the troposphere is chaotic, the predictability horizon is maybe around 2 weeks, perhaps a little more. But to make these interannual to decadal predictions, you need knowledge of the slower parts of the climate system. And I'm going to be talking about the ocean, and folks later are going to be talking about other aspects, land surface, ice, etc., stratosphere. So here I just want to start off with looking at the predictability of sea surface temperatures from this paper by Yeager et al. 2018. Gerald also showed results from this paper. So this assesses the skill of decadal predictions from the CSM decadal prediction large ensemble, 40 ensemble members, relative to ERSST version 5. The panel on the left shows years 1 to 5 averages, the middle is years 3 to 7, and the right panel is years 5 to 9. And so you can see that SST is predicted with high skill over many regions, and the skill doesn't degrade substantially with lead time. Now, the question is, this includes both the skill due to external forcing and the skill due to ocean initialization. So if you want to understand what the skill due to ocean initialization is, you can compare the skill of the CSM decadal prediction large ensemble to an uninitialized large ensemble, the CSM1 large ensemble. And so what's done here is the skill is assessed as an anomaly correlation coefficient, and we simply subtract the skill of the uninitialized predictions from the skill of the initialized predictions, and that's what's shown in these bottom panels. And you can see that the subpolar North Atlantic emerges as a place where ocean initialization enhances the skill for decadal SST predictions. So actually interannual to decadal SST predictions. And so this is the region that I'm going to be focusing on. And I'm interested in understanding why the subpolar North Atlantic is a region where ocean initialization increases skill of interannual to decadal SST predictions. I'd also say that, this Yeager et al. Paper is not the only one who has showed this. Smith et al. 2019 is another example, as well as Carspec 2014, and many others. So I asked, why is the subpolar North Atlantic a region where internal SST variations are predictable? Well, one hypothesis is just that there are deeper mixed layer depths in the North Atlantic compared to other basins, and this results in higher predictability. Okay, so the null hypothesis of SST variability, Frank and Johansson in 1997, is simply that the ocean temperature is set by the forcing, stochastic atmosphere forcing, and damping at a time scale tau. And this damping parameter is directly proportional. This damping time scale is directly proportional to D, the mixed layer depth, and inversely proportional to alpha, which is the damping parameter. The damping parameter is about 20 watts per meter squared per Kelvin. So this is basically a thermodynamic reason why the subpolar North Atlantic might have higher predictability. These reasons 2 and 3 are what I'm going to call dynamic reasons. Okay, so another possibility is that because the mixed layer depths undergo large seasonal variations in the subpolar North Atlantic, the seasonal reemergence of SST anomalies can enhance predictability. So basically, SST anomalies are isolated beneath the seasonal thermocline. SST anomalies formed in winter are isolated beneath the seasonal thermocline in summer. And when mixed layer depths deepen in the fall, this can enhance, these anomalies can reemerge, enhancing predictability. And a third possibility is that slow changes in the ocean circulation can enhance predictability. These could include both variations in the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation and changes in the strength of and position of the subtropical and subpolar gyres. So how are we going to quantify predictability of internal SST variations? So one way is comparing the skill of an ensemble of initialized predictions to that of an ensemble of uninitialized predictions. And that's basically the method that was used in Yeager et al. And many other studies. Another possibility is using statistical measures of predictability. These measures can be estimated from both observations and model simulations. And here are some examples of papers who have done this. And the measure that I'm going to be discussing in this talk is a very simple measure of predictability, a measure of the decorrelation timescale, T2. And T2 is simply the integral of the autocorrelation function squared integrated over all lags. And so I'm going to be discussing predictability of wintertime SST mostly in this talk. And the reason is because one would expect wintertime SST to have higher predictability. And I'm going to be applying this decorrelation timescale to both gridded SST observations and pre-industrial control integrations. So with the caveat that we're now looking at applying this to historical large ensembles, which are obviously much more comparable to observations, but this is a work in progress. But what I'm going to do here is focus on what I think are robust aspects that are not so dependent on, whether you're looking at initialized prediction or statistical measure from observations or even from a pre-industrial control simulation. Okay, so here's the result of this decorrelation timescale T2 for wintertime SST. I first want you to focus on the plot on the left, which is the result from observations from 1945 to 2020. I calculated T2 from wintertime values from ERSST and HAD1 SST, and then this is just the average of those two data sets. You can see that the T2 is largest in the subpolar North Atlantic, so this is consistent with the results of Yeager and other studies. And the results from pre-industrial control runs of CMIP6 models are shown on the right. So what I did is I calculated T2 from wintertime SST for 11 different CMIP6 models, and the average T2 is shown here. So you can see that in CMIP6 models, the predictability timescale is also longest in the subpolar gyre, and these in both models and observations, the predictability timescales are about 3 to 5 years. So the black contours show the annual mean mixed layer depth at contours of 200 and 400 meters. On the observational plots, these are the mixed layer depths from an Argo product. And the right is the mixed layer depths averaged amongst the CMIP6 models. And you might, so according to the null hypothesis, one would expect the predictability timescales. If the ocean was just forced by stochastic atmospheric forcing, you'd expect the predictability timescales to scale with the mixed layer depth. And you can see that they don't in a few regions. So T2 is the highest southeast of, in the central subpolar North Atlantic here, despite relatively modest mixed layer depths in that region. And T2 is actually very low in the Labrador Sea, despite very deep mixed layer depths in that region. Okay, so one thing I just want to mention here about the CMIP6 models, I used 11 different CMIP6 models. There were about 10 other models that I analyzed, but they had ice-covered Labrador Seas. And the pattern of the predictability timescales in these models with an ice-covered Labrador Sea is much different than in the models that don't have an ice-covered Labrador Sea. So here I've just shown the ones that are not ice covered in the Labrador Sea because, of course, in the real ocean, the Labrador Sea is not completely covered in ice. But I have a paper where I discuss all of these models, and I'd be happy to share it. Okay, so now we're going to ask, what is the impact of ocean dynamics in the predictability of wintertime SST? So in order to do that, I'm going to compare T2 from a pre-industrial control simulation of the CSM fully coupled model and a model in which the atmosphere is coupled to a motionless slab, which I henceforth refer to as the slab ocean model. In this CSM1 slab ocean model, the slab depth is set to be the annual mean mixed layer depth from the coupled model. So the plot on the left shows T2 from the fully coupled CSM1 model. And you can see that it's broadly similar to the CMIP6 mean. Highest predictability is in the central subpolar North Atlantic. The black contours are the mixed layer depth. And so you can see that, despite deep mixed layer depths in the Labrador Sea, there's low predictability there. The plot in the middle is T2 in the slab ocean model. And so you can see that in the slab ocean model, as you'd expect, the predictability timescale basically scales exactly with the slab depth, D. So D is the slab depth here, which is actually set exactly to the annual mean mixed layer depth. So that's why the contours are the same in these two plots. So you actually find that the T2 in the slab ocean model basically scales exactly with what you'd expect from the Franken-Yule and Hasselman null hypothesis. So right here, it's proportional to D, the slab depth, and it's inversely proportional to the model alpha. So it basically, the slab ocean model predictability timescale is perfectly represented by the Franken-Yule and Hasselman model. So now on the plot on the right shows the difference in T2, the difference in the decorrelation timescale between the fully coupled model and the slab ocean model. So here you can clearly see the fact that the central subpolar gyre is a region of enhanced predictability. So ocean dynamical processes enhance predictability in the central subpolar gyre. And T2 is smaller in the fully coupled model than the slab ocean model in the Labrador Sea, which suggests that ocean dynamics reduce predictability in the Labrador Sea. So now, because we find that the Hasselman model is such a good approximation of what the predictability is in the absence of ocean dynamics, we use this to assess the impact of ocean dynamical processes on predictability in our CMIP6 models, despite the fact we don't have corresponding slabs for all of these models. So the plot on the left is just a repeat of T2 in the CMIP6 models that you saw before, so largest in the central subpolar North Atlantic. The plot in the middle is the T2 that you'd expect from the Hasselman model. So I calculate the T2 that you'd expect for Hasselman based on the mixed layer depth and the alpha from each of the models, and I average it, and this is what I get. And you can see it scales basically perfectly with the mixed layer depth. So now I take T2 from the fully coupled model and I subtract T2 from the Hasselman model. And in the CMIP6 models, you get the same pattern that you saw in CSM1. that the region in the central subpolar gyre is a region where ocean dynamics appear to enhance predictability, and the Labrador Sea is a region where ocean dynamics reduce predictability.
2 minutes, Martha.
Okay, perfect. So basically I did the same thing with observations, and you can see here that in observations as well, the central subpolar North Atlantic is a region where ocean dynamics enhance predictability, and the Labrador Sea is a region where ocean dynamics reduce predictability. So what I want to show here is the role of reemergence of SST anomalies in setting this increased predictability in the subpolar North Atlantic. So when you look for reemergence, what you should look at is the seasonal autocorrelation function. So reemergence is when an anomaly formed in winter is isolated beneath the seasonal thermocline in summer. So there's a rapid decay of predictability, but that anomaly reemerges when mixed layer depths deepen in the fall. And so here's the seasonal ACF from observations, and you can see this reemergence process 1 year later, and to a lesser extent 2 years later. And so this suggests that reemergence of SST anomalies, so basically a 1D process, is a large aspect in creating this enhanced predictability in this region. So I just like to point out this paper from Yeager, which I'm sure will be discussed, has also looked in this exact region and shown that SST anomalies and upper ocean heat content anomalies are predictable using the decadal prediction experiments in this same region. And you should see Elizabeth Maroon's talk showing that that's less true for rapid changes in 2015. And Yeager basically believes that this scale is related to variations in the grain bank strength and the ocean heat content across 50 degrees north. So this is suggesting that both ocean heat content, ocean heat transport, and the reemergence are important in setting the high predictability in the central subpolar North Atlantic region. Yeager also showed that basically the ocean is not predictable in the Labrador Sea, just like I showed using these decadal prediction experiments. Okay, so in conclusion, I showed that Atlantic SST predictability is longest in the subpolar gyre, based on numerous studies from decadal prediction experiments, as well as statistical measures of predictability. Ocean dynamics enhance SST predictability in the central subpolar gyre. The processes include reemergence and variations in the AMOC. Ocean dynamics reduce predictability in the Labrador Sea. I didn't show this, but it appears to be related to large, unpredictable interannual mixed layer depth variations. And this may be connected to strong atmospheric forcing by the NAO in this region. And one note is that there has been recent work that shows that the NAO may be more predictable than than models indicate. So that may be relevant for predictability in the Labrador Sea, and I'm sure this signal to noise paradox will be discussed at length in the meeting. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks, Martha. And we'll have a 10-minute discussion after the talks. So we'll move on to the our following talk, which is also an invited talk. And I believe the speaker is in the room. It's Marika Holland. And Marika is a senior scientist at NCAR who's done a lot of seminal work on sea ice modeling and understanding sea ice variability processes in both hemispheres. And she's going to talk to us about prospects of multi-year predictions of the cryosphere.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's so weird to be in front of a live audience. I have to say, this is kind of awesome. And for those of you online, I hope I see you in person somewhere sometime soon. It's kind of nice to, be able to interact with colleagues and see your faces live. So as Ed said, I'm going to be talking about the cryosphere, and I'm actually going to specifically be talking about prospects for predictability in the Antarctic. And implications for biological systems, because a lot of the societally relevant aspects of this are that sea ice predictability influences the marine ecosystem as well. So I have a number of co-authors on this work, and this is part of some larger projects that we have ongoing, which I'll mention as I go through the talk. Okay, so when thinking about sea ice and predictability of sea ice, it's important to realize that in both hemispheres, but particularly in the Antarctic, sea ice undergoes a really enormous annual cycle. So that's what's shown here on the left plot. You can just see the climatological annual cycle from observations and a couple models. And the maps on the right side kind of put that into perspective. So you see that in February, this is actually February just last month, the sea ice retreats back to the Antarctic, reaches its minimum value, but then over the fall and winter, it expands and occupies a much larger area, and this shows September of last year. So you have, the sea ice last month was at 2.2 million square kilometers, and September of last year, it was over 18 million square kilometers. So an enormous annual cycle. Additionally, the sea ice variability, what sets variability in ice area, is associated with anomalies along the ice edge. And so that's what's shown here. This is just observations of Southern Hemisphere ice area on the left in different months for the time series. And then the maps on the right, you can see where those anomalies are present. And if in particular you look at September on the lower right, you can see that the anomalies in ice concentration that set the ice area variability really occur along the ice edge. So to understand variability or predictability in sea ice, you need to account for the fact that the sea ice and the location of relevant anomalies changes over the annual cycle. We do have observations that suggest that there's predictability in sea ice in the Antarctic on seasonal and longer timescales. So that's, I'm just showing one example here. This shows the relationship of sea ice to Amundsen sea low variability, which is a dominant sea level pressure variability in the Southern Ocean. So this shows coincident correlations. This is as a function of longitude. So you can see the continental outline of Antarctica here with the Antarctic Peninsula sort of sticking up here. And so what's shown are sea level pressure anomalies associated with the Amundsen sea low, sea ice anomalies correlated with the Amundsen sea low in the kind of red and blue brighter colors, and then sea surface temperature anomalies associated with the Amundsen sea low kind of above. And so you see that associated with a strong Amundsen sea low and corresponding wind anomalies, you have high sea ice and cold sea surface temperatures to the west of the low, just associated with the fact that you're getting more transport of sea ice and cold waters equatorward, and opposite if you look to the east of the low. Now, interestingly, so this is at the same time period, if you look at lagged correlations into the future, you see that ice concentration anomalies persist for multiple months and out through a year. So this just shows the correlation of ice area now as a function of longitude around Antarctica and the persistence of those. So there's suggestions from observations that anomalies in sea ice that are, in this case, wind-driven can be prolonged and last for at least a year, likely longer. Okay, so we've done work looking into this a little bit more using climate model experiments to try and get at mechanisms of predictability. And so the work I'm going to show you in the next set of slides uses perfect model initialized predictions. So we're really looking at the initial value predictability of sea ice. These are using the CESM2 model. Because we're running perfect model predictions, we're basically using the model to predict itself and looking at inherent predictability in the system. I've run 2-year predictions, and I've initialized these with different months. So I actually have 6 different sets of predictions initialized in January, March, May, July, September, and November. So we're trying to look at whether there might be an initialization dependence in terms of the time of year at which things are initialized. So what do these look like in terms of predictability of sea ice area? So what I'm showing here is the daily ice area predictability, shown on the x-axis as a function of longitude, so you can see the continental outline there. And then the time is shown on the y-axis. So you can see that, and moving up. Okay, so this is the anomaly correlation coefficient of ice area as a function of longitude. So higher values, of course, mean more predictable. And what you see is that there's very high predictability for the initial several months out to perhaps July or so, which is around just below day 200. You also see that in the Ross and Bellingshausen Amundsen Sea region, so kind of between 200 and 300 degrees east, there's high predictability that's retained for basically the first year of the predictions. Predictability is then lost on January 1st around the entire Antarctic. So we have this loss of predictability, but then predictability is regained around May 1st, and you have this predictable signal. Often in the sea ice community, this is called a reemergence of predictability. So a little bit different than the reemergence in our last talk, but in some cases associated with the same mechanism. And that this Ross-Bellinghausen Amundsen Sea remains predictable throughout the 2 years of the experiment with this loss of predictability over the summer months. Okay, so how does this look if we look at these different initialization times? So now I'm basically just showing the same plots, but for these 6 different experiments. So initialization in January on the upper left, March, May, July, September, November. So basically these are just being initialized at different times of year and then run through their 2 years of the prediction experiment. And what you see is actually that the characteristics, the predictability characteristics, look very similar regardless of the initialization timing. All of these simulations lose predictability around January 1st, and they have this return of predictability, especially in the Ross and Bellingshausen Amundsen Sea region around May 1st. And you can actually see that 2 years out. So for example, if you look at the middle panel on the bottom, those are the September initializations, and you can see that, you know, this May 1st reemergence of predictability happens in year 2 as well. And there's some suggestion that this would continue into a 3rd year. So we have multi-year predictability of sea ice in this case. So what are the factors that influence that predictability? So here I'm just showing the September initialized predictions. Just as an example, this is consistent across the different initialized prediction experiments. And so on the left panel is just the plot you've seen before. This is just the anomaly correlation coefficient for ice area as a function of longitude. And what I'm showing on the upper right panel is the anomaly correlation coefficient for sea surface temperature in January. So this is basically at this time when you start to lose predictability in the system. So what you see is that there's actually predictable sea surface temperatures in this Ross and Bellingshausen Amundsen Sea region, around 200 degrees east to the Antarctic Peninsula. And that coincides with the location of the December ice edge, which is shown in black. So those sea surface temperatures are predictable in that region, but as the ice melts back, and you can see the January ice edge shown here in white, as the ice melts back, it encounters waters that are less predictable. And so it loses this predictable sea surface temperature, which helps to provide predictability for the sea ice edge. So what happens when predictability reemerges in May? So this, again, is in part associated with longer-lived sea surface temperature anomalies and the large annual cycle of sea ice, and the fact that as you grow from the April ice edge here in black to the May ice edge and you're expanding away from the continent, you encounter sea surface temperatures that are more predictable and have retained their predictability. So there's a big aspect of just the annual cycle of the sea ice edge location and where ocean temperature anomalies are predictable in these CESM2 experiments. And we can look at this just a little bit more carefully. Here I'm just overlaying on the left-hand plot the anomaly correlation coefficient for sea surface temperature around the location of the sea ice edge. And what you can see is that it aligns very well with the ice predictability. And so there's a very strong correspondence between predictability of ocean temperatures along the ice edge and the predictability of the ice area in those locations. So what about implications for biology? So again, one of the important aspects of societally relevant aspects of predictability in the Southern Ocean is the fact that there are fisheries in this region, in particular krill fisheries. And so what we find in our experiments is that there is net primary predictability in these locations of ice edge predictability. So I'm showing here the shading shows the anomaly correlation coefficient for net primary productivity. The lined contours are the same thing for the ice concentration. And this would be in December of the year 2 of these predictions that are initialized in September. So, 15 or so months out. And you can see that there's a very strong correspondence, and we do have predictability in net primary productivity. And the mechanism that's providing this predictability is the fact that the sea ice and the location of the sea ice edge very much controls the light availability for the marine ecosystem. And so if we just look at the anomaly correlation coefficient for shortwave absorption in the mixed layer, that's what's shown in shading here. And you can see again that that strongly corresponds with the ice predictability that's shown in the lined contours. So basically, ice predictability gives you predictability in shortwave absorption, and that light availability gives you predictability in the ecosystem. And I want to note that this is this work we're doing to try and understand these relationships is part of this much bigger project, where we're not just trying to understand how sea ice is affecting net primary productivity, but how that in turn might be affecting krill and how that is affecting marine predators in the region. So we're working with seabird ecologists, seal biologists to try and determine and understand these links. And this is true on the short time scale, the kind of multi-year predictability time scale, but also on longer time scales, decadal and out longer, where our models suggest that there is large-scale reductions in sea ice in response to climate forcing.
2 minutes, Marika.
Okay, thanks, Ed. And part of this, in our case, so as I mentioned, there are these societally relevant aspects of Antarctic sea ice and the marine ecosystem in that region in the context of fisheries and also tourism and things like that, where sea ice conditions are actually matter. But we're also interested in how these aspects of predictability in sea ice and the marine ecosystem transition through these different aspects of the marine ecosystem and how these relationships will change in a warming climate. So again, we have this very large annual cycle of sea ice area. We also project that we will have large-scale reductions in sea ice. So where those ice edge locations occur is likely to change in the warming climate as well. And that will have impacts on marine ecosystems that will evolve in this warming climate. So we're working with people involved in the CAMLAR process, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, to try and understand what this might mean for where there should be locations for Antarctic marine protected areas. So this map of Antarctica shows where marine protected areas occur in the blue and where there's proposed marine protected areas in gray. So we're trying to provide this information on sea ice and its relationships to the ecosystem, how these things play out on multi-year timescales and longer timescales to try and determine where optimal marine protected areas should be located. And I think any talk on the Antarctic right now would be remiss not to mention that there have been some wild things happening in the Antarctic. So this just shows observations on the left of the November sea ice area over time. And 2016, there was this shocking event where there was this very rapid and extreme sea ice loss that occurred that year. Things have recovered a little bit since then, but just this past February, we reached the record minimum, in ever seen. So there are really large anomalies in sea ice area that we're seeing in the observations. And honestly, our models don't get these magnitude of anomalies. So it's suggestive that there's things that we need to consider improving in the model. And also just last week, there was these crazy warm temperatures that occurred over Antarctica. They made the news. This is just from an article in the Washington Post. And probably many of you heard about this. So there's lots of surprises and a lot more we need to understand about what's happening in the Antarctic. And with that, I know we're having questions afterwards. So thanks so much for your attention. And it's great to see all your faces. And yeah, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Marika, for a great talk. And next we have Elizabeth Maroon, who's an assistant professor. And I believe she's in the room too. So Elizabeth is an assistant professor in Wisconsin-Madison, and who will talk to us about a field prediction. Take it away, Elizabeth.
Hi, it's great to see all of you. This is my first in-person talk since COVID. I hope I remember how to do this. And I have a laser, this works. So I'd first like to thank all of my many co-authors on this talk. There's a lot of different folks who provided models for this study that is still in progress. So I'm going to talk to you about something that didn't work. And this isn't exactly a multi-year prediction. It's about sub 1 year prediction. But I'm going to argue that if you can't do within 1 year, then multi-year is not going to go so well. So the overall goal was you'd like to be able to predict extreme oceanic events, so large SST anomalies. And you'd want to do this for a couple of reasons. Like for on the left, for example, here I've got marine heat waves. So this is the 2013 to 2015 Northeast Pacific blob. Had a lot of huge ecosystem impacts on fisheries. And on the right here, I've got another blob. Students at Wisconsin think all I do is talk about blobs. But here's the cold blob in the subpolar North Atlantic in 2015. The reason why I'm studying this is because CSM1 Decadal Prediction Large Ensemble just totally missed this event. And it's also a really important event in terms of climate impacts downstream. So Jennifer Mecking has this great paper where she shows that if you do not have these SST anomalies predicted, you did not predict the European heat wave that occurred at the same time. So there's also a societally relevant impact for why you would want to understand these kind of large anomalies in SSTs as well. So this is the event I've been focusing on because it was just such a miss by the CSM1 Decadal Prediction Large Ensemble. So this is the subpolar North Atlantic cold blob. It was near record. As I said, it impacted European heat waves. But something also I noticed in the CSM1 Decadal Prediction Large Ensemble is that the subpolar North Atlantic SSTs, when you have an error within the first year, that makes things way worse. You know, we're going down to multi-year predictions, so like 3 to 7 year forecasts. And it's not just a persistence of missing these cold anomalies and it just sort of stays there. No, the trajectory just goes off in a different direction. I don't necessarily have a good idea of the mechanism for this. It's just a statistical fluke that's going on in there. But you really do want to get these kind of anomalies right within the first year. So that's what I've been trying to figure out. What happened? Why did the CSM1 Decadal Prediction Large Ensemble just totally miss? So before we go into what the CSM1 DPLE is and a bunch of other hindcasts have done, I think it's worth reviewing this one event since it was just so unusual. So this event actually started in November of 2013, which I don't even have on this plot because the CSM1 Decadal Prediction Large Ensemble even initialized from cold conditions in 2014 fall, couldn't sustain the cold blob. So 2013, this event starts. 2014, you have a modest cold blob that enhances and really peaks in summer of 2015, both in terms of intensity as well as its how large it was, the spatial extent. This event isn't just at the surface either. It's in the whole upper ocean. So here I've got the average temperature from 0 to 300 meters in this right-hand column. And you can see that there's like a peak intensity of it that kind of stays in pretty much the same location. It doesn't tend to amplify at all. It sort of stays the same and about the same location. And I think this is going to become important later in the talk. So this event was largely atmospherically forced. And there were two periods of atmospheric forcing that were important for sustaining or then amplifying the event. The first was winter of 2015. So in winter of 2015, you had very positive winter and spring NAO conditions. And what this did was it cooled off the surface, and it really allowed this event to be sustained. So if you didn't have this turbulent heat fluxes, you would instead just have started warming back up towards climatology. With winter mixed layer depths, they're a bunch deeper. So this isn't going to cool things off at the surface a ton because you've got that whole mixed layer depth to cool off. But it was really important for sustaining the event. The second piece was this rapid cooling in May through July. So in May through July, you've got shallower mixed layer depths. It doesn't take as much surface cooling to really give you a large anomaly. So during this period, there's probably modest cooling, roughly about 10 watts per meter squared. So that's all it really took to really amplify this event, most of the peak. So based on what I've told you, I'm going to argue that there were four features or things that you needed for this event. The first was you want to have a reasonable initialization in the subpolar North Atlantic at both the surface and throughout the upper ocean, because if that upper ocean heat content anomaly is necessary for you acting as some sort of reservoir of cold, you got to have that too. The second is you hope that maybe you'd be able to have a positive wintertime NAO prediction. So for positive NAO, some systems have shown that this kind of winter one prediction for NAO is possible. So in particular, I'm thinking about the papers such as Dunstone et al. 2016, et cetera. The third bit is that final push of cooling, that modest cooling in the summer from May through July. And you would hope that, okay, maybe if you're initializing in November, you're not going to be able to predict surface heat fluxes out 9 months in advance. But you would hope that you have sufficient spread in what types of surface heat fluxes each of your ensemble members are having, that you could at least encompass something that gets that rapid cooling. And finally, you hope that you've got a climate model that represents North Atlantic climate processes at least a little well. So here's what the DPLE did. On top here, the top left is observations in the peak of the event. So summertime 2015. On the bottom is the ensemble mean in the CSM1 DPLE from the November 2014 hindcast. So this is only, 8 to 9 months in advance. Not only did it not get an intense near record cold anomaly, it also actually has a positive SST anomaly in the same location. So a big miss. None of the ensemble members captured it. You can kind of see this in the plot I have on the right. So the orange line is the ensemble mean lead year one forecasts for the DPLE. The shading is all 40 ensemble members. The black line is the observations. And what you can see is that for 2015, highlighted here in the gray shaded area, it falls outside the DPLE spread. So it missed. So we went through a lot of possibilities to see, well, maybe there is something about this event that we can fix. So maybe CSM's just not a good model, cannot produce these kind of events. We cross that off. You can find similar types of cold events in the CSM1 large ensemble. Maybe this is a rare event, from the CSM large ensemble and from observations. This seemed to be like a kind of 1 in 30, 1 in 40-ish kind of year event. So maybe we just need to increase the ensemble size for this hindcast. That didn't help. Then we thought, okay, this is a lot of where this is going. Maybe some of the atmospheric forcing, so that NAO or the summertime is just unpredictable. And since that was so important for this event's evolution, maybe that's part of it. That seems likely. Possibly we thought maybe there's something wrong with this hindcast initial conditions that we can improve. So we did a whole set of sensitivity experiments. There were issues with Barents Kara sea ice that we thought might be degrading NAO evolution. We crossed that one off fast. There were some issues with the DPLE's ocean initial conditions, subpolar North Atlantic's too warm and too fresh. That improved things when we fixed that a little bit, but not entirely. We played around with atmospheric initial conditions to drive them more from observations. That actually made things worse, very counterintuitively. Happy to chat about why anytime. So this is where we came with the DPLE, is that there's some bit of atmospheric forcing, but there's also something wrong with it. So maybe it's just CSM. Let's check out other systems. So thanks to all of our collaborators in the Blue Action Project, we've got 8 different systems, 12 different hindcasts. I'm only examining the hindcasts that are initialized closest to the event. So from October, so 9 months in advance, to May, 2 months in advance. And I will just, the result is that, so each of these solid lines in color is an hindcast ensemble mean.
Elizabeth, 2 minutes.
Thanks, Ed. And each shaded color is a single ensemble member. Black is observations. The CESMs are all on top. You can see that they all tend to warm up for whatever reason. There are some, however, some ensemble members, especially in the Depressus 3 system, which has a lot of ensemble members that do capture the event. But none of the signals for those hindcast ensemble means really go that direction. So this is what month 1 looks like in all 12 hindcasts. So match up the color of the shaded is the anomaly in each of the hindcast ensemble means. The dashed line is the observed benchmark, so you want to match up the first shading to the first contour. You can see month 1, most of them are initialized, at least at the surface, pretty well. But this is what happens by the time you get to summer of 2015. Some of them totally missed it. Some of them you still have a bit of a cold blob. So like the Norwegian model, the CMIP5 version does pretty well, at least keeping that cold blob. These are the initializations from the CSM2 SMILE project, the ones that get much closer to the event. They hold on to it somewhat. So things are improving, but there's still a lot of misses. So in my last minute, I'll just sort of say, here's what, with this multi-model study we've learned so far. There seems to be that in the upper ocean, some of the models are being initialized with too small of an upper ocean heat content anomaly. And that's definitely something we think is wrong with DPLE. So if there is one possible place that you could think about improving, maybe it's in the ocean initial conditions. None of the ensemble means predicted an NAO that was as strong as what was observed, but a few ensemble members did. The spread in the surface heat fluxes across the whole multi-model hindcast, some of them did encompass the modest cooling that was observed. And if you subselect by the 4 ensemble members that have a positive NAO and modest summer cooling, you can get a cold anomaly. So I think I'll end this talk with saying this might have been an event where it was just extreme enough, and because atmospheric forcing, especially in the summer, was so big, maybe this signal was not predictable. But what I would argue is that what you should maybe concentrate on is getting the spread, especially for example, like the DPLE, such that it can encompass this kind of event. And it may not just be running more ensemble members. So thanks for the time, and I think there'll be questions after this.
Great, thanks Elizabeth for a really nice and interesting talk. And we're a few minutes behind schedule, and I noticed that we have a break scheduled for 9:40 Boulder time. So we have a few minutes for discussion, and I'll also let Matt in the room if we want to go over a few minutes over that break time. I'm going to need a little help since I can't really see the room. But we can start with a question for Marika that's posted in the chat. And this is from Adam Scaife, who says that you suggested that models cannot reproduce the sharp decline in 2016 Antarctic sea ice. And he's wondering if that's true across all years and ensemble members.
Yeah, so that 2016, so I've looked at this in the CESM 1 and 2 large ensembles, just looking at the spread of their interannual anomalies. And in neither of those model versions do you ever get a difference in ice in November of the magnitude that occurred between 2015 and 2016. So I can't say that this is true of all models. I haven't looked at all the large ensembles that are available, but definitely within the CESM models, it's just not, we don't simulate those kinds of events as what occurred in 2016.
Thanks, Marika. I don't know if you can hear me, but I just wanted to ask, how many ensemble members does that mean that you looked at? Did you say they were all for 2016, or did you look through the whole hindcast?
No, I looked through the whole hindcast, or I looked for a decadal period around this event. And so for CESM 1, I had 40 ensemble members. For CESM 2, I had 50 ensemble members. So 50 ensemble members plus 10 times 10 years, so 500 samples. So, I mean, it seems, at least within CESM 1 and 2, this would be an incredibly rare event. I mean, we don't simulate it in all those samples.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah.
All right, we have a question from Jerry Meal.
There's a question for Martha. It was interesting when you contrast the North Atlantic and the North Pacific, and that North Atlantic subpolar gyre always stands out as a really high predictable area. And there's been various proposals as to why that is. One is AMOC, which you're talking about ocean dynamics. One is external forcing. The aerosol forcing for the 20th century seems to provide some predictability, but the Hasselmann mechanism works in both the North Pacific and the North Atlantic. And so you're looking at long pre-industrial control runs, so you can kind of take out the external forcing and you still have an ocean dynamical component combined with the Hasselmann effect. So could you actually make the next jump and say, okay, it's AMOC's in the North Atlantic, not in the North Pacific. We get better predictability in the North Atlantic. Is it mostly the AMOC? Is that something you could actually conclude?
So, I mean, the mixed layer depths are also deeper in the North Atlantic, right? So both of those things, both Hasselmann and the AMOC would push for North Atlantic to be more predictable, right? So I guess, so in general, this area, like in the central subpolar gyre, tends to be more predictable than you'd expect based on Hasselmann, right? So it has to be an ocean dynamical process there, right? But it could be a 1D process or a 3D process. And, there can be gyre circulations that are important, so changes in the strength of the gyre circulations and the AMOC. And of course, because the ocean bottom isn't flat, those two processes are coupled, right? The gyre and the AMOC. So, I don't think I can clearly separate those. So, I can separate out what can be explained by Hasselmann, and that doesn't explain this region in the central subpolar gyre. Reemergence, which is also going to be bigger in the North Atlantic just because there's larger seasonal variations of the mixed layer depth, it does seem to play a strong role. So I think it's both the ocean heat transport and the reemergence that play a role. Yeah, it's not a I don't think it's just the AMOC, but I think the AMOC does play a role. And of course, you're right. There's no deep AMOC in the Pacific.
Thanks. I think we have a question from Hyan.
My question is for Elizabeth. Thank you for the nice talk. My question is, how typical is the 2015 code blob a model failure, as this is most skillful region indicator predictions? Is this because you're looking at a one-year event, or as so that's my question. Thanks.
I'll go up there. Hi, Anne. I've got a different mic, but I'll come wave at the screen at you since I know you're over there somewhere. So the event, there were 64 initializations in the DPLE. This was the one that was a miss. All 63 other were quite skillful, and it was because it was a year one forecast. So this was just like the one, if you're really trying to improve stuff in the DPLE, in what CESM's hindcasts, this is the one that's going to tell you the most about what went wrong. Does that kind of answer your question? Or
yes, thank you.
Sure.
And we have a question from Bill Merrifield online. He has a question for Martha. And Bill, if you're online, do you want to read it? Oh.
Sure. I haven't tested my mic. Am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So, Martha, that was you showed very nicely that the sort of decorrelation time can be used as a measure of predictability, but by nature, that predictability measure is, I guess you could say, Euler, so it's fixed in space. But conceptually, at least, there are processes that involve things moving, like advection of temperature, salinity, maybe biogeochemical anomalies, propagation of Rossby waves, that, something that's happening at point A at time A could influence what's happening at another point at time B. Have you or others thought of any diagnostics that could sort of detect that type of predictability?
So you're exactly correct that it's basically a local measure of predictability. So there could be sort of lagged correlations between other variables that could enhance predictability. So it's sort of like a minimum predictability you can think of. So one way you can assess that is by comparing to like initialized predictions and see if you get different results, right? So for example, if in the Labrador Sea, the predictability was low based on the decorrelation timescale, but it was higher in the initialized predictions, then you'd say, well, there has to be, it's probably some non-local process. So that's one way to get at it, is to compare, to other means of predictability. Another thing that people have done is looked at linear inverse models to measure, the predictive skill of a linear inverse model. And people have actually done this calculation where you consider local and non-local processes. So in the Pacific, they've shown that the subpolar, the extratropical SSTs are sensitive to the tropical SSTs, right? So you get a degraded predictions of extratropical SSTs if you don't give information about that connection, right? So if you only consider local processes like I'm doing. They did that same calculation in the Atlantic, and they found that the predictability, like so basically you don't need the tropical SSTs to understand the subpolar predictability. So at least in a broad brush region, like this local analysis seems to be more appropriate to the Atlantic, for example, than the Pacific. So, it's not like a full answer, but that kind of gives you a sense of like how reliable this very simple measure of predictability might be.
Thank you.
This is,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think there's two questions in the room now, Ed. This is Rob England-Wills with a question for Liz Maroon. First off, very nice talk. And I see you're kind of leaning towards the failed atmospheric prediction as an explanation here. But I was wondering if to test this, you could look at reanalysis forest ocean runs and see if they're reproducing these. And have you done that? And what have you found?
No. Yeah, great. So yes, the CSM1 DPLE is initialized from a reanalysis driven forest ocean simulation. So that would be like the easiest comparison, right? If the DPLE is FOSSI, it's what it's initialized from, can't get this event, then okay, maybe you can't imagine it. It does have the cold blob in it, and about the same magnitude as what was observed. Pattern's a bit off, but it's pretty close. So yes, tried that. That doesn't help.
Right. And do we have a second question from the room?
Should I go?
Look at your chat. Go to Noel online next. Noel, if you could unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my question is a little bit related to Bill's question, actually, and it's to Marta. It was a very nice talk. So I think this signal to noise issue is sort of not, you commented on it in your talk towards the end in the case of the Labrador Sea, but if you're trying to understand the role of initialized predictability versus uninitialized, so the role of ocean dynamics may play a wider role than just the Labrador Sea. So how do you think about this?
So, I mean, one thing about the signal to noise paradox, right, is it's actually a lot stronger for sea level pressure and the NAO, and actually precipitation compared to SST. So it appears that the underestimation of the predictable signal of models tends to be more related to the atmospheric quantities, so like the sea level pressure and the precipitation, and that appears to be less of a role in the sea surface temperature. Now, if these atmospheric quantities are more predictable than we thought, that could force the ocean to the forcing could be more predictable, and so that is a possibility elsewhere as well, but particularly in the Labrador Sea. So I don't know, does that answer your question in the sense that, like, I think the signal to noise paradox is less important for SST than these other variables. And, you know, I guess there's some work that to me suggests that this is so, you know, why is the NAO less predictable? It could be that it's not sensitive enough to SST anomalies. That's one possibility. Although I think some of the other explanations, like stratosphere, like not models that don't capture the stratospheric predictability, may have, like, so I'm not, what I'm saying is I'm not sure this NAO predictability is oceanic. The signal to noise paradox of the NAO, I'm not convinced that's oceanic in origin. It could be, but I think a lot of the literature suggests other processes.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree. Thank you.
We have time for one last
okay,
question
sorry.
in the room. Antonella?
Okay, yeah, this is a quick question to my neighbor here, to Elizabeth. Yeah, so this cold blob that happened in the North Atlantic actually happened kind of in tandem, sort of with the warm blob in the Northeast Pacific. And so chances are that they are both linked to the large-scale persistent atmospheric pattern. Have you looked into that, or have you tried to look at the predictions of the warm blob in the Pacific, and was there more scale?
So I'm sitting right, for those who can't see us, I'm sitting right next to her, so I'm answering the question, passing the mic around. So at some point I did, for this event, try to look and see if there was a common ENSO link, and that if if ENSO hadn't been initialized well in this hindcast, did that affect the cold blob? Because obviously that was linked at least partially to the warm blob in the Pacific at that time. I didn't see anything that was too interesting, so I kind of let that one drop. But funny you should say is that I have a grad student at University of Wisconsin right now who's actually looking into the predictability of that warm blob in the Northeast Pacific. And we haven't thought about looking to see if the two events are linked, but maybe we will, so stay tuned.
Thank you.
Right. Well, thanks everyone for some really nice talks and fun discussion. And I'm sure if you might still have questions to our speakers, and hopefully you can find them or email them in the next few hours or couple of days. And we will have a break, and we will be back at 5 minutes past 10 Boulder time. So 5 minutes behind the official schedule. And we'll see you in a little bit.